I call this having premonitions. The death of my brother Vince. 2 months before his death, just after his wife left, the sheriff had picked up his car in Campbell River. This was where his wife and brother Simon's wife had gone. So Vince phoned me in Campbell River and asked me to pick it up and return it to Terrace. He knew that I was working at the pulp mill there, and a week later I took a week off work and drove the car 1,000 miles north to return it to Vince. It was a pretty uneventful trip. The car was a Delmont 88 with all the luxury features of the time. Deep cushioned seats that tilted, raised, lowered, slid forward and backwards, all electrically. Beautiful sound out of the radio, almost all the way home, and the heater would keep you warm in 40 below zero weather. For a big car, it cruised gracefully at 80 miles per hour wherever there was a stretch to let it loose a bit. Vince had warned me to watch it because there was a tendency to be doing 80 when you reached a corner. Naturally, you would be 300 yards into the Tules before you turned if you didn't slow down in time. When I reached Terrace, I called home and asked my mother where Vince could be found since he would be doing electrical work somewhere in town. My mother told me where the building was, and I drove there, and I was totally exhausted from the drive, which made me sensitive to the real world. When Vince saw his car approaching, he left the building that he was wiring and met me in the driveway. He said, "Let's go over to my house and celebrate by having a drink. It's not every day that my car comes home." "Did you want to drive, Vince?" I asked. "Heck no," Vince said. "You drove all the way here. You can make it over to my house, couldn't you? I'll be a passenger for a little trip." I backed out of the driveway and started off, but where the speed only reached about 5 miles per hour, the steering wheel pulled wildly from side to side. This happened about 3 times even though I had both hands on the wheel and holding it as hard as I could. There was a strong enough entity in control of the wheel. Finally, Vince said, "Geez, if this is how you drive, how'd you make it up here? Here, let me drive." I got out totally puzzled by the actions of the car and went around to the passenger side. Vince took the wheel and began driving home. He lived across the river. As he drove along the river with a toothpick in his mouth, I looked down to a big rock where we used to fish as kids. Suddenly, I had a cold feeling in the pit of my stomach. I felt as if I were alone in the car. "I'm going off the road and I'm not even behind the wheel," I thought. Quickly I turned, but there was Vince driving, toothpick in his mouth and a little grin on his face. This happened several times where I felt that way. Then I looked across the river. Above the little hill there was a black cloud, umbrella-shaped in the clear blue sky. "Look, Vince, there's a black cloud across the river," I exclaimed. "There's no black cloud," Vince said. "There isn't a cloud in the sky. Can't you see it? It's just above the hill on the other end of the bridge." Vince just glanced at me. He says, "You're overtired from the 16-hour drive. Like I said, there isn't a cloud in the sky." The cloud stayed there while we drove across the bridge and up the hill. Then it suddenly moved further ahead to the left. "Look at it," I exclaimed. "It's right over your house." "Ron," Vince said condescendingly, "you need a rest." The cloud stayed there until we drove into the driveway. Then it mysteriously disappeared. In the house, Vince poured 2 little shots of whiskey and said, "Here's to my car coming home." After he drank, we talked for a minute or two, and then Vince said that he had a couple of hours of work left in the house he was working on, so he went back to do it. I hadn't told Vince that I was allergic to alcohol, but I just dumped it in the sink. While Vince was gone, I felt so sad that I had to do what I could to help Vince. The sink and kitchen counter were full of dirty dishes and wine glasses. I washed and wiped them and stacked them neatly in the cupboards. Then I washed the table and the kitchen floor. Now I went into the bedroom and then made the bed and vacuumed the rug in the front room. After I was finished, I walked across the Skeena Bridge and home to my mother's house. I told her about the strange things that happened. She just looked at me strangely, not realizing that I had a series of premonitions. That night, Vince had a party with his little house filled with friends. When I got there, the record player was playing a fast song. Instead of dancing, people were just jumping up and down since there were so many people jammed in the front room. They were having fun anyway. All of a sudden, to me, it felt as if people were dancing on a grave. I couldn't help myself. I went and turned off the record player. "Everyone go home. Party's over," I yelled. No one understood, but they left anyway. My sister said, "Ron, what's the matter with you? We were just beginning to enjoy the evening." I just picked her up in my arms and packed her out. "You just want a drink," I said. "That's the end of it for tonight." I didn't really understand my own actions. "This isn't your house either," she said, trying to rescue the night. "Vince, help! He's hurting me." Vince says, "She's right, Ron. It's my house. What's the matter with you?" I'm damned if I know. All I know is that I feel like people are dancing on a grave. I guess I better go home. I walked across the bridge, sleep, which is frozen rain, coming straight down the river, froze my right side. I didn't notice it at all. When I got home, my mother said, "Ron, what happened?" I'm damned if I know, but I just wrecked Vince's party. It felt as if people were dancing on someone's grave, so I chased everyone out. Vince sent me home. I caught the plane to Vancouver the following morning, dejected but relieved that I did what I had to do, even if I didn't understand why. Life had just turned around for Vince after his wife had left him with his little boy. He was in a real low point. He was too proud to go south and beg for her to come back, but now he had a girlfriend that thought the world of him. Marge was a jewel of a lady. Even when his ex had a baby girl in Campbell River, he stayed in Terrace, BC. Terrace kissed no one's ass to be alive was his view. About 2 months later, 2 days before it happened, I dreamt that I and my 3 brothers were in the army. We were holding a position at the top of a hill. The timber had a V clear cut in front of us. We were at the narrowest point near the top. The army in black uniform were boiling up over the hill at us. I and my brother Cy were shooting Sten guns with 50-round clips, while Marv and Vince were falling back a little ways to behind a log. They were reloading their guns with fresh clips. My Sten gun was red hot from the constant firing of bursts of 3. Each burst hit the enemy, one in the left leg, one in the stomach, and one in the right shoulder. My hand was burning from the melting gun. "For Christ's sake, Marv, start firing! My gun is melting," I hollered over my shoulder. Cy had a left-handed Sten because he was left-handed, and he was running out of ammunition as well. "Peel out," Marv hollered back as he finished slapping in another 50-round clip of bullets. He and Vince began firing in unison as I and Cy turned in opposite directions and began running up the hill while reloading 50-round clips into our guns. All of a sudden, Vince's head snapped sideways, and he flipped over backwards. I dropped my Sten, it was melted anyway, and grabbed Vince's. I brought it up and turned to continue firing. The army in black disappeared. The attack was ended. I knelt beside Vince and grabbed the side of his head, which was at a 90-degree angle from his body. I put my fist against the opposite side of his neck and snapped his head straight. Vince went, "Ah!" and his body jumped and expelled his air. As I knelt there, I looked up at Cy and saw a real sad look on his face. It reminded me of a story of a disciple asking Christ if it would be himself that would turn Christ into the Romans, with a sad look on his face. When I woke up, my left hand had a painful black burn across the palm. I went to the doctor and he called it a psychosomatic burn since he didn't have a good reason for it to happen in my sleep. I knew that Simon had something to do with Vince's dying. The burned hand showed how real that dream was. In the morning, the dream was so clear in my mind that I told my wife at the time to call my mother at Terrace and tell her my dream. She always deciphered dreams and warned the proper people of the future danger. She didn't do it this time. I didn't follow up on it after work. I just assumed that she had done it. In my exhausted state, I didn't ask. The thought of Vince dying was just too hard to accept. 2 days later, the accident occurred. The accident itself had a series of events that made everyone in the family blame themselves. My older brother was supposed to ride to the coast to go fishing with Dad. For some reason, they argued about 10 miles out of Terrace. Dad returned to Terrace and dropped him off. Dad blamed himself, and Marv blamed himself. Mom blamed herself since she was sensitive to something bad about to happen. My sisters blamed themselves since Vince had made such a production of "I'm not going to live forever," when he had bawled them out for not being more self-sufficient when they had gone for a drive about 2 weeks earlier. Since Marv was dropped off in Terrace, he found Simon and asked him to drive him to Prince Rupert. Cy agreed, and Harvey Potter and Vince and his girlfriend, Margaret, decided to go for a ride. Cy was driving, Marv sat in the middle, and Harvey sat near the passenger door on the front. Margaret sat behind Cy in the back seat, and Vince sat behind Harvey. The Department of Highways had decided to extend the highway past Prince Rupert to a bay where more shipping could take place. Since a bridge was going across a ravine, they had made a bus turn just in front of the bridge on the right side. Then, in their wisdom, the city council decided to redirect the road through the center of the city to not lose any business. So the bridge was swung to the left at a 45-degree angle to the direction the road was aiming at the town center. Since there was no yellow center line in the rain, if a driver was following the right side of the road, he would drive into the bus turnout and suddenly find that he'd have to make an instant left turn. The bridge itself was built with a pedestrian walkway on the right side with a cement post on the road side of the walkway at each end of the bridge. A car had hit the walkway the weekend before with a dry road, but luckily no one was killed. Since the road was dry, they didn't slide into the post very hard. They were white people, so no one was charged. When the wet road, dark rainy night, and no yellow center line, Simon didn't have a chance. Even doing the speed limit with a sudden left 90-degree turn, his car slid into the post hard. The post ripped off the door and Harvey's right arm at the shoulder, broke the center post, and drove it into the car and broke Vince's neck. Margaret slid out the open side of the car door and fell on the road with the car dropping on top of her, crushing her. Marvin flew out of the windshield and landed on his stomach down the road. His eyes dropped out of his head, and his heart ripped out of all the muscles that hold it in place. By some piece of luck, no arteries were torn. Because 2 white people were killed, Simon, an Indian, was charged with several charges, even though there were 4 more accidents with people killed on the following weekend. The police wouldn't drop the charges. No one else was charged unless they were really drunk. I drove up to Prince Rupert as soon as I heard of the accident. It took about 21 hours, and I went to Sunnyside Cannery where Mom and Dad lived during the summer. As I drove up the park, Simon walked up the road. He had that very sad look on his face, just like in my dream. I knew that he was the driver. We went into the home and I rested for about a half an hour and then drove to Prince Rupert. At the mortuary, as I was going to see Vince's body, the mortician said, "It's too bad. Just try and remember him as he was." I said, "Get out of the way. I came to see my brother." I had to push him aside. In the room with all the cement slabs, there were 7 bodies covered with white sheets. Some were from the other accidents around Rupert. I felt his soul above the 3rd slab, so I went over and threw the sheet back. His head was at a 90-degree angle with his spine sticking out of the side. The mortician stood at the doorway. I said, "This is all you had to do to make him look normal." I placed my right fist at the brake and my left hand on the side of his head and jerked his head straight. He expelled his air that was trapped in his lungs with his esophagus pinched off with a loud "ah," and his body convulsed. At this moment, I knew that if I prayed for him, he would come back alive. Unfortunately, I broke down crying instead. The mortician jumped back out of the doorway. Several years later, a friend who became a psychologist told me, "You should have tried to pray. Imagine how powerful it would have been for your people if they knew that there was someone in their midst that could raise the dead. And if it didn't work, your mind would have been at peace knowing that you did all that you could for him." My brother Vince, God bless him. I do miss him.